Hello, dear students, my friends, and all the viewers. This class is about hemorrhagic shock, and I'm Dr. Santosh Patil, Professor of General Surgery and Minimal Access Surgery. This class will be a continuation of my previous class on shock. In shock, the last class, you can just click the link below to follow my previous class where I addressed in detail about the pathophysiology of shock in general. In this class, I will be speaking on hemorrhagic shock. Hemorrhagic shock, which is also known as a hypovolemic shock, it is the most common shock in a surgical or any trauma patient. The best treatment for any patient having a hemorrhagic shock is by simple arresting the point of bleed. Fluid resuscitation and blood transfusion. The role of fluid resuscitation and blood transfusion in any hemorrhagic shock is only to prevent the physiological exhaustion. The patient left untreated, or if the bleeder is not stopped, the patient is going to go into a pathophysiology which is called as vicious cycle of death. That is nothing but coagulopathy, acidosis, and hypothermia, and patient will succumb to death. That is why it is best is all the conservative management are just to halt the process, but it is not a definitive treatment. The coagulopathy, the acidosis, and hypothermia, which is a vicious cycle of death, has been asked plenty of times in the NEET examination, and definitely I'll be addressing that in detail. There are certain host response that is happening in the patient body whenever patient is having a hemorrhagic shock. There are two things that has to be kept in mind. One, whenever there is a blood loss, that results in decreased baroreceptor stimulation and decreased inhibition of the vasoconstrictor centers in the brainstem. So body responds in a way where it increases the chemoreceptor stimulation of vasomotor centers as well as diminished output from the atrial stretch receptor. So basically it is increasing the chemoreceptor stimulation, which further leads to vasoconstriction and also increases the peripheral arterial resistance. The second mechanism that is happening, or the host response, is nothing but a sympathetic stimulation. This sympathetic stimulation is mainly to restore the blood into the vital areas. So whenever there is a hypovolemia because of the hemorrhage or ongoing blood loss, there is a sympathetic stimulation which activates certain hormones, that is epinephrine and norepinephrine release, further activation of the renin-angiotensin cascade, and increased vasopressin release. These things I have already discussed in the pathophysiology of shock in my previous class. What happens is it is mainly to maintain the blood flow in the vital or the important structure, that is CVS and the CNS. CNS, which lacks the sympathetic activity, the blood flow is mainly maintained by the local autoregulation. So pathophysiology that is happening is any patient who has a trauma, that is tissue trauma and hypovolemic shock that is associated with, leads to an endogenous coagulopathy that has been described as acute traumatic coagulopathy. This acute traumatic coagulopathy is seen in 25% of the affected patient within few minutes of onset of trauma associated hypovolemia, which has been seen with associated with 4 times increased mortality in these patients. There is this chart which definitely explains where a patient with hemorrhage undergoing shock will have a tissue hypoperfusion. This tissue hypoperfusion will lead to acidosis. Acidosis in turn decreases the function of the coagulation proteases, decreasing the coagulation, leading to again coagulopathy. The same patient with hemorrhage and shock, whenever there is a tissue hypoperfusion, the muscle fails to generate adequate heat, which again causes hypothermia and decreases the functions of the coagulation factors. So when again the third factor that is leading to vicious, I'm coming to the vicious cycle of that. Then a patient with severe hemorrhage with shock, whenever patient is given resuscitation with lots of fluids, or it can be in the form of blood, that will leads to severe dilution and decreases the coagulation factors, further again leading to trauma induced coagulopathy. So these three things, that is dilutional coagulopathy, acidosis and acidemia, and hypothermia, all these three things are responsible for the vicious cycle of death. If left untreated, definitely patient will end to trauma induced coagulopathy and further death. There are other factors like shock and trauma will lead to acute trauma induced traumatic coagulopathy, which again in turn leads to trauma induced coagulopathy. End point is trauma induced coagulopathy, that is going to cause the death of the patient. There is one pathway where a patient with shock and trauma, as I discussed in my previous class also, the tissue proteins are exposed in the form of DAMPs as well as HMB proteins, which are taken up by the Toll receptors and initiates a cascade of complement as well as cellular mechanism of tissue reaction that will lead to vascular endothelial damage, further again leading to trauma induced coagulopathy. So depending upon the types of hemorrhage, there are a revealed hemorrhage which clearly indicates there is an open source of bleeding, and there is a concealed hemorrhage which needs thorough suspicion and acted upon with some investigation. Revealed hemorrhage, there is an obvious external hemorrhage, and for example there is a patient with open arterial wound or from a massive hemostasis on an endoscopic view which shows a definitely bleeding from a duodenal ulcer. Concealed hemorrhage is contained within the body cavity, and definitely some or the other causes that may lead are one, occult bleeding from the gastrointestinal bleeding or ruptured aortic aneurysm. This purely requires high suspicion, clinical suspicion, as well as confirmed with only active investigated patients. So depending upon the types of hemorrhage, there are primary hemorrhage, reactionary hemorrhage, and secondary hemorrhage. The primary hemorrhage is the bleeding that is occurring on the table or whenever due to an injury to a patient, which can be on the table during the surgery as well. The reactionary hemorrhage is nothing but a delayed hemorrhage that occurs within 24 hours. This is usually because of the increase in the patient blood pressure, or it can be because of the severe during extubation. There may be a dislodgement of the slippage of the ligature, dislodgement of the clot that will lead to bleeding that is called as delayed hemorrhage. The secondary hemorrhage is nothing but a sloughing of the vessel wall, usually seen on 7 to 14 days after injury. There are certain factors that leads to sloughing of the vessel wall. Those are infection and pressure necrosis. Again, there are certain types of hemorrhage which are called a surgical hemorrhage and non-surgical hemorrhage. Surgical hemorrhage are the one due to a direct arterial injury which are amenable to surgical control. Definitely a surgical control has to be done to stop the bleeding. Non-surgical hemorrhage are the one which are general oozes purely seen because of the platelet functionality, deficiency of platelet functionality, or maybe because of some coagulopathy. It can be hemophilia or it can be a von Willebrand disease where patients are treated only with the correction of coagulation abnormalities. Then the patients are categorized into degree of classification. So depending upon the amount of blood loss, the patients have been categorized into 4 types. Type 1, class 1, class 2, class 3 and class 4. And depending upon the loss of the blood, the patient's symptomatology also changes, and how there is a method how the patients are monitored to the response to the treatment that I will be discussing in the form of a dynamic fluid response. So class 1 is one where there is blood loss about less than 750 ml, about 15% of the volume is lost, and usually patient have mild tachycardia, but there is no fall in the blood pressure or though no CNS symptoms. In class 2, the blood loss is almost 75 to 750 ml to 1500 ml blood loss is there, which is about 15 to 30%, and more. Then patients have a tachycardia and orthostatic hypotension, and anxiousness sets to start, that is CNS manifestation starts. So grade 3 is one more than 30 to 40% of the blood is lost. This percentage is very very important because they have been repeatedly put into your NEET examination for the undergraduates, and where the systemic manifestations are very certain and very easy to pick up. That is, patients has tachycardia. Even with resuscitation, patient tachycardia doesn't subside because the amount of blood loss is massive, and patient has a persistent hypotension even with good correction of the fluid, and CS manifestations are profound with confusion. Grade, that is class 4, hemorrhage is one where patient loses highest blood, that is more than 40%, that has been asked again in your NEET exams. Heart rate more than 140, severe hypotension in obtunded or total confused state. So how to manage the patient with shock? There is a link below. One, based upon the degree of hypovolemic shock, we just now I discussed, depending upon the hypovolemic degree, how much the patient has lost the amount of blood. On clinical parameters we assess and we categorize the patient, and we have to check the vitals, preload assessment and base deficit. These preload assessment and base deficits I have mentioned in detail, that base deficit anything more than 6 millimoles per liter has got high morbidity and high mortality. So this base deficit is analyzed by blood gas analysis. Any patient with shock, definitely all patient must be undergoing compulsory ABG before initiation of treatment, during initiation and after the completion of the treatment. One confirmed base deficit is reduced, only then a patient is out of risk of shock. Then patient should be treated with dynamic response to fluid therapy. There is a link below that clearly mentions the first, the second, third and the fourth points in detail of my previous class. I will be starting with dynamic fluid response. Dynamic fluid response is nothing but it is mainly used to determine the shock status of a patient. It assesses the cardiovascular response whenever a fluid is given. It is nothing but a cardiovascular response to the rapid administration of the fluid. They give about 250 to 500 ml of fluid is rapidly given to the patient over 5 to 10 minutes. Then the cardiovascular response in the form of a heart rate and blood pressure and central venous pressure are monitored, and depending upon these things, the patients have been categorized into different. One is the responders who respond to the fluid challenge, transient responders and non-responders. Responders are the one, there is improvement in the cardiovascular status which is sustained, means that indicates there is no other further ongoing loss, so patient is responding fluid therapy alone and he should be continued, and there is no actively ongoing losing of the fluid but require filling to normalize the volume status, means whatever the blood percentage wise he has lost, that has to be normalized. The transient responders are the one where there is improvement which reverts to its previous states, means within 10 to 20, means the amount of blood approximately is moderate fluid loss is there. Non-responders are the one where there is more than 40%. They are a clinical degree of classification which come under grade 3, class 3 or class 4 patients where there is severe volume is depleted. Even with the good correction of fluid response, there is no improvement in any of the cardiovascular response. So how do you manage the patients with hemorrhagic shock? One important thing is identify the cause of the shock. Where is the source of the bleeding? And immediately resuscitative maneuvers has to be done to stop this bleeding. Identify the site. The site has to be identified depending upon the, I'll be coming with that in detail again. And hemorrhage control. So once we know where is the bleeding, then we have to immediately take measures to stop the bleeding. There is one entity that is called as damage control resuscitation, which is being picking up rapidly in patients with trauma associated hemorrhage and acute severe blood loss, where immediately resuscitation has to be done primarily to stop the bleeding, to prevent patient going into coagulopathy and to avoid patient going to setting of infection. It is purely to stop acute bleeding. This again I'll be telling in detail. So coming one by one, first how to identify the hemorrhage. Hemorrhage can be an external hemorrhage or concealed hemorrhage, and we have to see whether if it is an external hemorrhage, definitely we have to just give a external compression to stop the bleeding. Immediate resuscitative maneuvers where direct pressure has to be given, airway and breathing should be assessed and controlled, and patient has to be immediately given with a large bore intravenous access, a 2 venous access on both hands or over the leg. If it is severely, veins are not available, a 16 gauge needle has to be passed and venous access has to be gained. A central line preferably if the bleeding is massive or patient does not respond to the fluid therapy also. Emergency blood has to be arranged because there is no specific fluid that is advisable for a patient with hemorrhagic shock other than blood. Blood is the best replacement for the blood loss. So first we have to identify the site of hemorrhage, then it helps in defining the next step, because if you do not know where is the site of the hemorrhage, we cannot stop the bleeding. The prime treatment of any hemorrhagic shock is to stop the point of bleeding. If we know where is the point of bleeding, then we can stop either by surgery, or patient can be taken for endoscopic clipping of the duodenal bleeding from the duodenal ulcer, or a angioembolization can be done from a occult bleeding from the gut. Then we can get this history of bleeding either from clues from the previous history. The previous history can be in the form of a patient complaining of repeated similar episodes in the past with bleeding episode. It can be hematemesis, or patient with who is a known case of aneurysm, or patient with old peptic ulcer disease using some NaCIDs in the recent past will again definitely give some clue to the history. On clinical examination can be just finding on the external abdominal examination. If there is a blunt trauma to the abdomen, just on clinical inspection alone we can make out there is a signs of external injury in the form of abrasions, or sometimes very rarely it can be penetrating trauma. External abdominal examination is very important. On palpation there may be tenderness, there may be guarding associated. This needs to be elicited. Per rectal examination one has to look for the melena if at all. And rapid investigation. More important to these things is clinical history may not be accurate in coming to a diagnosis. In such cases, these patients should be subjected for very selective and limited investigation to pick up the source of bleeding in the form of chest X-ray and X-ray of the pelvis to rule out for the fractures associated with trauma, and abdominal ultrasound. This is nothing but a fast ultrasound, which is nothing but a focused assessment with sonography in trauma patient, which assesses the 4 clinical areas, that is which looks for the collection or free fluid in the abdominal cavity, that is in the right hypochondrium, that is perihepatic space, epigastric region for the pericardial space, left hypochondrium for the perisplenic phase, and in the pelvic region for the pelvic collection. There is another technique that is extended fast, where both lungs can be assessed by bilateral anterothoracic sonography. So these are the few rapid evaluation in the emergency room itself, where patient bleeding the source of bleeding can be assessed, and patient can be immediately subjected for operation theatre. Instead of patient going for the CT scan, MRI, it is better to analyze before only. Or diagnostic peritoneal lavage can be done if there is a blunt abdominal trauma to rule out any bleeding into the intra-abdominal cavity. So once the source of point of bleeding is identified, patient that needs to be controlled. One, if it is patient can be taken for operation room for stopping of the bleeding, or angioembolization can be done, or endoscopic clipping can be done for the bleeding from the ulcers. And better to avoid for unnecessary other investigation prior to the surgery or bleeding control. Surgical intervention is limited to stop bleeding and control the sepsis. That is classical description for the damage control resuscitation. And definitive repairs are delayed until the patient is hemodynamically stable. There are few points I want to add that has been described for the damage control resuscitation, where the important thing is to anticipate and treat acute traumatic coagulopathy. So whenever there is a one doctor thinks there is a maximum bleeding that is happening place, he has to immediately explore the place and stop the bleeding. For example, trauma associated injury to the liver, where massive bleeding will be there, but exact source may not be identifiable, which artery is bleeding. In such cases, abdominal cavity is opened immediately and thorough packing has to be done. The packing idea is to prevent any fresh bleeding and patient going into hypovolemia. The main reason is the patient blood pressure, that is systolic blood pressure, has to be sustained to 80 to 90 millimeters of mercury, which prevents dislodgement of the clots, is the theory, and permissive hypotension until hemorrhage is controlled. And important thing is to limit crystalloid and colloid infusion. So there is no definitive role which fluid is ideal for patient to supplement with IV fluid in any trauma patient. Even textbook Bailey in the latest edition does not mention which is the ideal. There is no ideal resuscitative fluid, because none of the fluids are plasma expanders. They do not expand the intravascular component, nor the crystalloids nor the colloid. Any patient with hypovolemic shock, end results is hypoperfusion, acidosis and hypothermia. So any fluid that can increase the oxygen saturation to these tissues, only such fluid should be used. So blood is the only best or the best replacement for this thing. Whenever the blood is not available, if at all asked in a multiple choice question in the NEET examination, Bailey still mentions crystalloid can be a given the option, crystalloid can be taken if blood is not available at that moment. If blood is the option, blood is the first treatment. And last is damage control resuscitative surgery to control the hemorrhage and preserve the physiology. That is very important. So if we can follow these steps, definitely a patient with hemorrhagic shock can be managed and treated with less complication. So that is about the hemorrhagic shock. I'll be talking few points about the traumatic shock, because in recent past they are asking questions related to the traumatic shock. This traumatic shock is slightly different from a septic shock and also different from hemorrhagic shock, where traumatic shock is a combination of a systemic response after trauma with associated soft tissue injury. It can be in the form of a injury or fracture to the long bones which is associated with blood loss. These patients are highly prone for multi-organ failure in the form of respiratory distress syndrome, because the hypoperfusion which is there, this is always also associated with initiation or the activation of the inflammatory cascade process, which will again let the patient go into severe hypovolemia, and see that vicious cycle of death is rapid in these patients compared to other patient. The cellular changes are typically ascribed to the only in septic shock. At the cellular level, as described in my previous class also, there was one chart that clearly mentioned the cellular products that are released from the tissue damage are DAM proteins, that is damage associated molecular proteins, that is ribonucleic acid, uric acid and high mobility group products that are picked up by the pattern recognition receptors, which includes the TLR family proteins. This is a chart which clearly explains on the right side there is a trauma followed by there is an injury to the tissue which exposes the damage of molecular protein which are picked up by the TAL receptors. This leads to activation of cellular activation, further leading to tissue hypoperfusion and shock. Important thing in management of traumatic shock is source of bleeding may be there, may not be there, but tissue damage is always there. So whenever there is a tissue damage has to be addressed. First, a patient can be corrected with individual elements to diminish the inflammatory cascade process. Start high IV antibiotics, prompt control of hemorrhage, adequate volume resuscitation has to be done with good correct oxygen supplementation. Debridement, that is a more important point here, is in any traumatic patient is debridement of the non-viable tissue, because these are the source for the infection to initiate the process of inflammation. Then stabilization of bony injuries, if at all associated, has to be done with priority. Treatment of the soft injury, primary closure, secondary closure, depending upon the type of class of class we have to decide, and a decision has to be taken. More importantly, it has to be cleaning the area, high oxygen saturation, control of bleed and removal of the dead tissue as much as possible. That is the ideal treatment for traumatic. A shock can be asked in the form of a simple shock, for which my previous class I have discussed in detail. A hemorrhagic shock for today's class. It may be asked as a little confusing question as a traumatic shock. Traumatic shock is slightly different from the hemorrhagic shock, where there are associated tissue injury also. So that I think I have given a clear picture about the hemorrhagic shock and the management as well. So thank you.